I used to think lies were the scariest thing in a marriage. I was wrong. The absolute worst is when the man lying next to you every single night starts believing a fairy tale concocted by his own mother, one slow piece at a time until it sounds more real than reality itself. By the time he slid those divorce papers across our kitchen table, I didn't cry or scream. I didn't have to, because the night before, I found the trail she left behind when she was too certain she had already won. My name is Brooke Bryant. I am 38 years old, and my marriage is quietly ending on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The sky over our suburban Charlotte home is the exact color of bruised iron, heavy with a late autumn rain that stubbornly refuses to fall. The kitchen, with its vast expanse of white marble and custom oak cabinets, usually feels like the warm, beating heart of this house. Today, it feels exactly like a sterile interrogation room. The low, constant hum of the stainless steel refrigerator is the only sound breaking the suffocating silence as I stand completely frozen, staring at my husband, Evan Mercer. He reaches out slowly and slides a thick, intimidating stack of pristine white papers across the cold stone of the kitchen island. The heavy thud of the document seems to echo sharply against the subway tile backsplash. Divorce papers? The black ink on the top page blurs together in my vision, but the violent intent behind the carefully typed legal jargon is blindingly clear. I do not look down at the papers right away. I simply cannot. Instead, I look past Evan, letting my gaze drift to the sunlit breakfast nook just a few feet away. His mother, Lorraine Mercer, sits there. She is perched delicately on the edge of the tufted linen chair, her posture impeccably straight, her perfectly manicured hands resting neatly in her lap. She wears a beige cashmere sweater that whispers of old, quiet wealth and generations of unearned confidence. She is terrifyingly calm. Lorraine does not look like a grieving mother witnessing the devastating collapse of her only son's life. She looks like a seasoned theater director watching opening night from the absolute best seat in the house, utterly satisfied with how her lead actor is delivering the lines she meticulously wrote for him. I pull my gaze back to Evan. I stand there and wait for the fire. I wait for the flushed cheeks, the raised voice, the chaotic, desperate energy of a man who firmly believes his wife has committed the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. I brace myself for the bitter accusations to be hurled across the island, but the fire is completely absent. Instead, Evan looks at me with a dry, hollow exhaustion. His broad shoulders are slumped, the crisp collar of his pale blue work shirt unbuttoned at the neck. His eyes are flat, dark, and entirely vacant. He is not fighting me. He is not seeking answers or demanding a confession. He is already gone. He looks exactly like a man who has packed his bags, walked out the front door, and driven 1,000 miles away in his mind long before this actual moment arrived. That sudden, quiet realization hits me much harder than a physical blow. The sharpest agony of this gray afternoon is not the physical stack of legal documents demanding the abrupt end of our lives together. The true bone-chilling devastation is the absolute clarity that my husband prepared himself for this catastrophic outcome entirely on his own. He silently mourned our marriage, processed my supposed betrayal, and hardened his heart completely in the shadows. He convicted me without a trial. He swallowed the poison fed to him and believed the vicious lies before I was even granted the basic human right to open my mouth, look him in the eye, and fiercely defend my own honor. I do not reach for the expensive silver pen lying innocently beside the documents. I do not cry. I do not drop to my knees on the polished hardwood floor and beg him to listen to reason. Instead, I place both of my hands flat against the cold, hard edge of the kitchen island. The deep chill of the stone seeps into my skin, rapidly grounding my racing pulse. I press down firmly until my knuckles turn a stark, bloodless white. I expect a massive flood of blind panic to rise in my throat, a rush of hysterical denial to spill from my lips, but the emotional tidal wave never crashes. In its place, a freezing, absolute lucidity washes over my entire body. The panic instantly drains away, leaving behind nothing but a cold, sharp, and highly dangerous alertness. I steal another slow, deliberate glance at Lorraine. Her dark, calculating eyes meet mine across the open room. There is no fake sympathy in her expression, no forced sadness for the sudden death of our union. There is only a deep, abiding, and triumphant patience. It is the chilling look of a predator watching the steel jaws of an elaborate trap finally spring shut on its oblivious prey. In that single, drawn-out second of intense eye contact, the thick fog lifts. I understand everything. This is not a sudden, chaotic eruption of standard marital discord. This is not a tragic, organic misunderstanding that somehow snowballed out of our control. This is the grand finale of a meticulously cultivated master plan, nurtured over many long months, quietly watered in the dark, resentful corners of this family's sprawling estate. Before this toxic poison took root, before the heavy shadows lengthened and distorted everything in this beautiful kitchen, Evan and I truly had a life together. We really did. It was a life ordinary enough to feel incredibly real, and beautiful enough to make outsiders deeply envious. When I close my eyes against the harsh overhead lights, I can still feel the lingering phantom warmth of it. We spent our early 30s building a remarkably solid foundation. We shared late dinners sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, eating spicy takeout from cardboard boxes while arguing playfully over what vintage movie to watch. We took long, spontaneous weekend drives down the rugged coastline, the car windows rolled all the way down, the radio blasting our favorite songs, his warm hand resting casually on my knee. For years, Evan was the calm, steady center of my often chaotic world, a quiet man who safely anchored me without ever making me feel tied down. Our marriage was a smooth, brightly polished surface, but I am learning the very hard way that no surface is entirely without flaws. There were always cracks, tiny, barely visible hairline fractures that seemed entirely insignificant at the time. The brief, tense disagreements over joint finances, the frustrating way he would instinctively defer to his mother's opinion whenever we faced a difficult life decision. I foolishly ignored the flashing warning signs. I arrogantly thought the deep, unconditional love we built over the years was thick enough to seal those minor fissures permanently. I was hopelessly naive. I forgot the fundamental rule of a strong house. Cracks are exactly where the most destructive pests enter. I forgot that a tiny fracture is all a patient, determined enemy needs to eventually tear the entire structural foundation apart. We were genuinely happy. Or at least, I was absolutely certain I was happy. I truly thought Evan was too. But looking at the defeated, gray stranger standing across from me right now, I realize with horrifying clarity how easily the warmth of those precious memories has been deliberately rewritten. Someone had taken a sharp, heavy chisel to those tiny cracks, working away tirelessly day after day, week after week, until the entire load-bearing structure of our mutual trust collapsed completely. And I know exactly whose perfectly manicured hands held that chisel. The air in the kitchen feels 20 degrees colder now. The heavy rain finally begins to fall outside, tapping a relentless, mocking rhythm against the large bay windows. Evan shifts his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable in the heavy, stretching silence. He desperately wants me to pick up the pen and sign my name. He wants this painful confrontation over. He wants to escape the uncomfortable, messy reality of executing his own marriage. But I remain perfectly still, my hands securely anchored to the stone counter, my mind furiously racing backward through the timeline of the past several months. I am rapidly piecing together the subtle, strange shifts in his behavior. The whispered telephone conversations abruptly ended the exact second I walked into a room, the cold shoulder heavily disguised as a long, tiring day at the office. I take a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the stale, dead air of our dying marriage. I will absolutely not sign these legal papers today. I will not give them the immense, immediate satisfaction of a swift, unquestioning, and silent surrender, because as I look closely at the two people occupying my home, the grand illusion entirely shatters. I see the ugly, undeniable truth. I see the invisible, tight strings perfectly connecting Evan's profound emotional exhaustion directly to Lorraine's immaculate sitting room poise. What exactly did I see flashing across my mother-in-law's face in the suffocating, silent tension of this kitchen? A fleeting, terrifying micro-expression that made me absolutely, undeniably certain that this impending divorce did not begin with the organic doubts of a heartbroken husband, but with the ruthless, calculating, and bottomless greed of a mother. I pull my mind away from the suffocating chill of the kitchen and force myself to remember the man Evan used to be. Before the silence swallowed us whole, before his mother orchestrated this sterile execution of our vows, there was a beginning, a real one. We met when we were both relentlessly clawing our way up the professional ladder. I was 29 and exhausted, working as an operations manager at Harbor Point Civic Systems. My days were consumed by urban data consulting, drowning in zoning regulations, traffic flow metrics, and municipal budgets. It was a chaotic, high-stakes environment where I thrived purely on stale coffee and sheer stubbornness. Evan, on the other hand, was the newly appointed head of the project division at his family business, Mercer Holdings. He operated in a world of sleek boardrooms and inherited leverage, worlds away from my gritty spreadsheets. Our paths collided during a joint city infrastructure planning initiative. What drew me to Evan was not the heavy weight of his last name or the tailored cut of his expensive suits. It was his remarkable, unshakable calm. In a cramped conference room full of loud, aggressive contractors and anxious city officials fighting fiercely for resources, Evan sat back, listened quietly, and only spoke when he had the exact, pragmatic solution. He was the kind of man who did not need to suck all the oxygen out of a room to prove he was in charge. He possessed a quiet, grounding gravity. To a woman whose entire life had been a frantic, uphill battle just to survive, his steady presence felt like the ultimate sanctuary. He made me feel incredibly safe, simply by existing next to me. We were entirely different creatures born of entirely different ecosystems. I grew up in a loud, working-class neighborhood where money was something you measured in double shifts and late notices. My parents worked tirelessly with their hands and their backs to keep a modest roof over our heads. I built my career from the ground up through rigid organization, relentless persistence, and an absolute refusal to fail. I earned every single thing I possessed, but to Evan's parents, particularly Lorraine, my calloused background was not a badge of honor, it was a permanent stain. In her refined, old-money social circles, I was never viewed as an equal partner for her son. I was quietly categorized as a beneficiary, a clever opportunist who had managed to attach herself to the Mercer legacy to enjoy a free ride. I did not belong, and she ensured I felt the sharp, polite edges of that truth at every family gathering. The only saving grace in that imposing family was Evan's late father, Arthur Mercer. Arthur was a shrewd, self-aware man who recognized the suffocating nature of the empire he had built. Surprisingly, he adored me. He saw past my lack of pedigree and respected my grit. I remember sitting with him on their sweeping veranda one humid summer evening, nursing tall glasses of iced tea. He looked at me with his piercing eyes and told me I was the only person with enough fire to keep Evan anchored to the real world. Arthur feared his son would eventually become nothing more than a passive, empty shadow of the Mercer name, simply following the path laid out for him by a domineering mother. He believed I was the lifeline Evan needed to become his own man. Losing Arthur just 2 years into our marriage was a devastating blow, one that removed the only protective shield I had against Lorraine's quiet hostility. Before we walked down the aisle, there was a prenuptial agreement. It was handled discreetly, slid across a polished mahogany conference table in a high-rise law firm. At 29, blindly in love and fiercely protective of my own independence, I viewed the thick document as a mere legal formality, a wealthy family tradition. I skimmed the heavy legal jargon, entirely uninterested in the intricate divisions of assets and corporate shares. My pride dictated that I prove to Lorraine and the entire world that I was marrying Evan for his heart, not his portfolio. I signed my name in thick black ink, completely ignoring the specific, buried clauses that would eventually become the very weapons used to destroy my life. I will not pretend our marriage was a flawless fairy tale. The first few years were incredibly rocky. We clashed violently over finances, his casual disregard for budget sheets crashing head-on into my deeply ingrained survival instincts. We fought over our brutal work schedules, spending weeks passing each other like tired ghosts in the hallway. But our most bitter, exhausting fights were always about his mother. Evan had a deeply ingrained, almost reflexive habit of seeking Lorraine's approval for every major decision we faced. Whether we were discussing buying a new car, choosing an investment portfolio, or deciding which neighborhood to settle in, her invisible hand always guided his choices. It infuriated me. I felt like I was constantly competing with a phantom who had a permanent seat at our dining table. Yet, despite the fights and the looming shadow of his family, our marriage was fiercely real. We built a genuine, pulsing life together underneath the pressure. I remember the late-night dinners, ordering greasy takeout and eating it straight from the cartons while sitting on the bare floorboards of our first unfurnished living room. I remember the spontaneous, chaotic weekend trips to the mountains, getting completely lost on winding back roads and laughing until our ribs ached under the pouring rain. We had our own private language, a collection of quiet inside jokes that could make us smile from across a crowded room. We spent lazy Sunday mornings sketching out ambitious renovation plans for the house, arguing playfully over paint swatches and tile patterns. We even started whispering about the future, tracing the shapes of imaginary children in the empty air, wondering if a little boy would inherit his quiet eyes or my stubborn chin. We were a real family, entirely separate from the Mercer Empire. Evan loved me. I know he did. I can still feel the heavy, comforting weight of his arm thrown over me in the middle of the night, drawing me close in his sleep. That love was not an illusion. It was a solid, breathing thing that we nurtured together. And that is precisely what makes the current reality so agonizing. The betrayal I am facing now would not feel so much like a fatal wound if the love had not been so profoundly genuine. The fact that we had something so beautiful and true makes the systematic dismantling of it an act of pure, unadulterated cruelty. The foundation was solid, but the enemy was already inside the gates, patiently waiting in the parlor. I should have recognized the exact nature of the threat long before today. The warning was there, subtle but terrifyingly clear. It was a Tuesday evening, perhaps 4 years ago. Lorraine had dropped by unannounced, a common occurrence I usually tolerated with a tight smile. I walked into the home office to bring her a cup of fresh coffee. She was standing perfectly still by Evan's heavy oak desk. A binder containing a copy of our prenuptial agreement was lying open on the leather blotter. He must have been reviewing it for some routine tax filing. Lorraine was staring down at the open pages. She was not reading the legal text. Her eyes were completely unfocused, yet intensely sharp. She ran a single, perfectly manicured fingernail slowly down the length of the page, tracing the invisible lines of a clause I had long forgotten. I stopped in the doorway, the ceramic cup suddenly heavy in my hands. The expression on her face was not one of idle curiosity or motherly concern. It was a look of cold, calculating anticipation. In that brief, chilling moment, my mother-in-law was not looking at a standard legal agreement between two people in love. She was staring intently at a deadly, unexecuted sentence, quietly waiting for the perfect day to hand the executioner the axe. When Arthur passed away, the massive, impenetrable structure of the Mercer Family Trust was forcibly cracked open for probate and internal restructuring. It was during that suffocating, grief-stricken period of endless estate audits and tedious paperwork that a dormant, easily overlooked clause within our prenuptial agreement suddenly woke up and bared its incredibly sharp teeth. I had signed those intimidating legal papers years prior without a second thought, blinded by my own naive pride and a stubborn, burning desire to prove my absolute financial independence to his fiercely judgmental family. I never bothered to deeply analyze the dense, archaic legal text buried somewhere around page 40, but the estate lawyers certainly did, and their private findings ultimately changed the entire trajectory of my life. The provision was brilliantly, subtly devastating. A ticking time bomb wrapped tightly in formal legal jargon. It dictated a very specific financial penalty regarding a seemingly useless piece of commercial property. The clause stated clearly that if Evan was the party to legally initiate a divorce, a designated parcel of commercial land would be severed from the family trust and transferred entirely into my name as a protective settlement. At the time of our crisp autumn wedding, that specific land transfer felt like a hollow, almost insulting concession. The property was a forgotten, heavily overgrown lot sitting adjacent to a decaying industrial stretch on the far edge of the county limit. It was essentially useless dirt. It produced absolutely zero revenue, harbored rusted wire fencing, and was categorized internally by the Mercer accountants as a completely dead asset. It was purely symbolic, a clever piece of legal theater designed by their high-priced attorneys to make the draconian marital agreement look somewhat equitable should it ever be scrutinized by a judge in open court. But real estate is a highly volatile, living creature, and in a rapidly growing state, geography is ultimately destiny. Exactly 3 years after we stood at the altar and said our vows, the State Transportation Board finalized a massive, sweeping legislative initiative to expand the regional logistics and freight corridor. That dead patch of dirt was suddenly sitting dead center in the newly zoned commercial transit hub. Overnight, the forgotten lot was transformed into prime development acreage for corporate warehousing and interstate distribution. The valuations skyrocketed practically in the blink of an eye, leaping from a negligible tax write-off to a staggering appraisal of over $3 million. I remained blissfully unaware of this massive, life-altering financial shift. I never tracked the intricate daily fluctuations of the Mercer family portfolio. I had my own highly demanding career at the consulting firm, my own steady paycheck, and an intense, deeply personal desire to keep my hands completely clean of their generational wealth. I actively maintained a rigid, impenetrable boundary when it came to their money, preferring the exhausting but honest reality of my own hard work. Ignorance was my chosen armor, a deliberate way to protect my dignity in a family that valued net worth above all other human traits. But Lorraine wore her financial knowledge like a loaded weapon. She obsessively monitored every single decimal point, market trend, and property assessment connected to her surname. While I was busy analyzing municipal traffic data and infrastructure budgets for my city clients, my mother-in-law was quietly attending closed-door dinners with the family estate attorneys. She sat in dimly lit, high-end private dining rooms, the heavy oak tables covered in sprawling financial dossiers, sipping expensive vintage wine and calculating the exact legal exposure of her son's marriage. Every billable hour she spent with those men in sharp suits was dedicated to mitigating the disaster I represented. She would return from those intense strategy meetings and sit in my living room on Sunday afternoons, perfectly composed. She would sip the tea I brewed for her, compliment the floral arrangements I bought, and ask about my workday with a terrifyingly placid smile. She acted as if the very ground beneath my feet had not just turned into solid, undeniable gold, expertly hiding the sheer panic of a woman watching a perceived thief unknowingly stand directly over her vault. The sudden, explosive influx of value completely altered the fundamental geometry of our relationship. In Lorraine's calculating, hyper-vigilant mind, I was no longer merely a low-class annoyance who used the wrong fork at formal dinners or spoke too proudly about my working-class upbringing. The personal, petty distaste instantly mutated into a severe, existential corporate crisis. I was now a walking, talking $3 million liability. I was a direct, living threat to the airtight preservation of the Mercer estate, a foreign entity poised to legally siphon a massive fortune straight out of their carefully guarded empire the moment the marriage soured. To a woman whose entire identity, social standing, and sense of self-worth were built entirely on the ruthless retention of family capital. My continued presence in Evan's life was no longer just irritating. It was completely and utterly unacceptable. However, the ironclad wording of the prenuptial agreement presented a massive tactical problem for her. Lorraine could not simply bully me into leaving. She could not offer me a meager, insulting settlement check to quietly pack my bags and disappear into the night. The legal trap was remarkably specific. The severe penalty clause only activated if Evan pulled the trigger himself. But there was one crucial, universal legal caveat that every wealthy family relies upon to protect their assets from ruin. The payout would be instantly nullified if Evan filed for divorce based on a documented, fault-based cause. If I severely breached the marital contract through extreme negligence or gross infidelity, the $3 million would instantly evaporate from my grasp, leaving me with absolutely nothing but ruined credit and a destroyed reputation. This was the precise crux of the dilemma that kept Lorraine from launching a loud, public, and messy frontal assault. She could not afford a standard, drawn-out marital dispute. She could not simply whisper poison in Evan's ear and demand he leave me just because she disliked my background. If he left me out of simple fatigue or fading love, I would walk away a millionaire. She was entirely backed into a tight corner by her own legal safety net. She was absolutely forced to make Evan voluntarily believe that he desperately needed to leave me, and more importantly, he needed to leave me for a legally destructive reason. He needed to be the devastated victim of a severe marital crime. The sheer brilliance of her malice lay in its quiet, methodical execution. Instead of desperately trying to push me out of the house through direct, exhausting daily conflict, Lorraine chose a far more sinister and highly effective route. She realized that trying to break a strong bond from the outside was far too risky and might actually push Evan to defend me. So, she decided to rot our foundation from the inside out. She chose to meticulously, patiently, and flawlessly transform me into the ultimate villain. She decided that the absolute best way to protect her $3 million was to completely rewrite my reality, strategically turning me into a lying, deceitful, cheating wife in the eyes of her own son. The destruction of my marriage did not begin with a catastrophic explosion. There were no shattered plates violently hurled against the dining room wall. No bitter screaming matches echoing through the dark hallways at 2 a.m. And no sudden, tearful confessions of lost love. The end arrived with a quiet, agonizing, and terrifying subtlety. It crept into our home like a freezing winter draft, seeping steadily beneath a poorly sealed wooden door. Slowly and deliberately, dropping the temperature of our daily lives, until I found myself constantly shivering in the middle of my own living room. The very first symptom of this invisible disease was a profound, physical withdrawal. For years, driving together meant Evan resting his right hand casually over mine on the center console, a silent, steadying, and deeply familiar point of contact that anchored me after a long day. Then, on one remarkably ordinary Tuesday morning, his hand simply remained firmly planted on the steering wheel. Both of his hands gripped the dark leather tightly, his knuckles turning a faint shade of white, his eyes fixed rigidly on the gray asphalt ahead. When I asked about his upcoming meetings, his responses shrank from vibrant, detailed stories about his team into short, measured, and entirely hollow sentences. He was physically occupying the driver's seat right next to me, but his spirit had entirely vacated the vehicle. Then came the questions. Initially, they masqueraded cleverly as the normal, mundane inquiries of a husband who was simply interested in his wife's daily routine, but very quickly, the underlying tone shifted dramatically. The casual, loving curiosity morphed into a clinical, suffocating, and highly calculated interrogation. He stopped asking how my project presentations went and started asking highly specific, deeply unsettling logistical questions. He would casually lean against the polished kitchen counter, holding a glass of water, and ask exactly why my evening commute took 22 minutes longer than usual on a random Thursday. He would casually inquire about who exactly sat across the table from me during a quick midday lunch run to the crowded deli near my office building. He demanded to know, with chilling precision, why my cellular phone battery died and went straight to automated voicemail for 3 solid hours during a quiet Saturday afternoon when I was supposedly just running errands at the local market. The questions were always delivered in a flat, emotionless voice, completely stripped of any obvious anger or accusation, which somehow made them infinitely more terrifying to answer. At first, I desperately rationalized his bizarre, auditing behavior. I constructed elaborate, highly logical, and deeply forgiving excuses for the man I loved. I convinced myself that he was simply buckling under the immense, crushing weight of his heavy corporate responsibilities. The Mercer family business was a brutal, unforgiving, and relentless machine, and as the head of the project division, Evan carried the severe stress of hundreds of employees and massive quarterly margins squarely on his shoulders. I told myself that the intense financial pressures of maintaining his wealthy family's heavy legacy were simply bleeding over into our personal sanctuary. I swallowed my growing anxiety, poured him stronger drinks in the quiet evenings, and tried tirelessly to make our home as peaceful, quiet, and frictionless as humanly possible. I firmly believed that if I just gave him enough breathing room and unyielding grace, the dark, heavy cloud hovering over his head would eventually break and dissipate. But the dark cloud did not dissipate. Instead, it was actively fed, encouraged, and meticulously nurtured by a very deliberate, frequent guest. Lorraine began appearing at our front door with an alarming, unprecedented regularity. She never came empty-handed, always armed with an airtight, politely weaponized excuse that made it utterly impossible for me to lock the door and turn her away. She would arrive unannounced on a Wednesday evening, holding a heavy ceramic dish of baked pasta, claiming she just wanted to personally ensure Evan was eating a hearty, home-cooked meal during his incredibly stressful business quarter. She would show up early on a Sunday morning wielding a yellow tape measure and a notebook, insisting she had brilliant, necessary new ideas for remodeling our guest bathroom and wanted to check the dimensions. She openly declared to my face, with a smile that never quite reached her calculating eyes, that her frequent visits were strictly to help Evan decompress, to generously take some of the heavy domestic burden off my tired shoulders since I was clearly so terribly busy with my own demanding career. Her physical presence in my carefully curated home was undeniably suffocating, but the true horror was the invisible, toxic residue she always left behind long after the heavy front door clicked shut. I began to notice a terrifying, undeniable, and entirely predictable pattern. Every single time Lorraine drove her pristine luxury sedan away from our property, the emotional temperature in my marriage plummeted another 10 degrees. After her seemingly innocent visits, Evan would retreat entirely into his private study, closing the heavy oak door with a quiet, dismissive, and final click. When he finally emerged hours later, he looked at me completely differently. The sheer exhaustion and emptiness in his dark eyes were entirely replaced by a cold, hardened, and deeply embedded suspicion. He looked at me not as his trusted wife of several years, but as a dangerous stranger he had just been explicitly warned about. It was as if during those quiet, isolated moments alone with him in the kitchen, while I was purposely staying upstairs or out watering the garden, someone had leaned in close and steadily whispered a completely distorted, grotesque, and highly convincing version of our life together directly into his ear. The invisible poison floating through our hallways soon manifested into a very specific, explicitly named target, Miles Avery. Miles was a senior data analyst at Harbor Point Civic Systems, a quiet, mildly awkward, and intensely focused man who sat exactly 3 cubicles down from my own office. We were nothing more than polite, professional colleagues who occasionally shared a fresh pot of break-room coffee or briefly collaborated on massive municipal zoning spreadsheets. He was entirely inconsequential to my personal life and utterly invisible outside the walls of the firm. Yet, out of absolutely nowhere, Evan began dropping his name into our sparse evening conversations with a jarring, highly unnatural frequency. If I mentioned a difficult, exhausting client presentation, Evan would immediately stop reading his emails and ask if Miles was the specific person who helped me build the digital slide deck. If I mentioned that I casually grabbed a black coffee from the lobby cafe on my way up to the office, he would sharply ask if I happened to bump into Miles standing in the line. He deliberately weaponized the name of a mild-mannered man he had never even met in person, expertly turning a boring, harmless coworker into a looming, shadowy, and constant phantoms sitting at our dining room table. The sheer absurdity and the suffocating weight of the situation finally broke my long-practiced, silent patience. One incredibly tense Sunday evening, as the heavy, unyielding silence threatened to crush the absolute last bit of remaining air out of our dimly lit living room, I sat down on the sofa right beside him. I kept my voice entirely calm, low, and steady, fighting the desperate urge to scream. I told him we were clearly drowning, that our foundation was cracking, and that we desperately needed objective, professional help to navigate whatever dark, confusing waters we had recently drifted into. I gently but firmly proposed immediate marriage counseling. I offered to personally find a neutral, highly qualified therapist, someone entirely removed from the heavy gravity and vast influence of the Mercer family. A safe, quiet space where we could just be two ordinary people fiercely trying to save their life together. Evan did not even turn his head to look at my face. He kept his dark eyes locked firmly on the blank, black television screen across the room. His refusal was absolute, breathtakingly cold, and delivered without a single solitary trace of hesitation. He stated flatly, his voice devoid of any warmth, that he absolutely refused to sit in a brightly lit room and pay a total stranger hundreds of dollars an hour to interpret something that was already as clear as day. His harsh words hung heavily in the stale, dead air, incredibly sharp and terrifyingly unyielding, clear as day. I sat completely frozen, staring at the side of his rigid face, tracing the familiar, strong jawline of a man I suddenly did not recognize at all. In that agonizing, stretched-out moment on the sofa, a horrifying, crystal-clear realization washed over my entire body, completely and utterly destroying my very last remaining shred of optimistic hope. I finally understood the true, sinister nature of his bizarre, clinical questions, the constant, unnatural name-dropping of my confused coworker, and his absolute, unwavering refusal to seek any outside, objective help. Evan was no longer a confused, hurting husband desperately trying to piece together the truth about his struggling marriage. He was not asking me those questions to genuinely understand my day, to soothe his own rising insecurities, or to actively bridge the massive, growing gap between us. He was coldly interrogating me. He was methodically, ruthlessly testing every single word that nervously came out of my mouth to see if my panicked answers perfectly matched the intricate, devastating, and entirely fictional script that someone else had already meticulously written for him. And I knew, with an absolute, bone-chilling, and undeniable certainty, that his mother firmly held the pen. The silent, creeping tension that had been suffocating our household finally snapped on a completely unremarkable Thursday night at roughly 10 o'clock. There was no grand preamble, no slow build of an argument over dinner. Evan simply walked into the dimly lit living room, turned off the television right in the middle of a late news broadcast, and stood by the cold stone fireplace. He did not sit down. He did not look at me with the agonizing conflict of a man desperate to save his marriage. He looked at me with the hardened, absolute disgust of a man who had finally caught a thief in his own home. And then, he dropped the anvil. He looked me dead in the eye and stated, in a voice entirely devoid of any warmth, that he knew absolutely everything about my ongoing affair with Miles Avery. He did not pause to let the sheer shock of his words register on my face. He immediately launched into a rapid, relentless barrage of accusations, firing them off like a perfectly memorized list of criminal charges. He claimed that I was not just sleeping with my coworker, but that I had been methodically and secretly siphoning thousands of dollars out of our joint savings fund for the past 6 months. He accused me of deliberately funneling our marital assets into a hidden, private account at a local community bank, quietly preparing a lucrative exit strategy so I could abandon him the moment my new life was fully funded. I sat completely frozen on the edge of the leather sofa. My lungs physically forgot how to draw in oxygen. I expected him to shout, to throw something, to demand a hysterical confession. Instead, he coldly detailed the absolute proof he claimed to possess. He told me he had seen the horrifying photographic evidence with his own 2 eyes. He spoke of thick stacks of printed screenshots, displaying highly explicit, late-night text messages exchanged between my phone and Miles. He listed specific, itemized hotel invoices from a discreet downtown boutique establishment, complete with dates and times that perfectly matched my late afternoons at the office. He cited the exact routing number of the alleged secret bank account bearing my full legal name. The most terrifying aspect of that entire confrontation was not the grotesque, fictional narrative he was weaving. The true horror was his delivery. I did not shed a single tear. I could not. I was entirely paralyzed by the chilling realization that my husband was not asking me a question. He was reading a final, heavily stamped legal conclusion. He spoke with the absolute, unwavering conviction of a judge who had already reviewed the grand jury indictment and was merely passing down the mandatory sentence. There was no room for debate, no margin for error, and absolutely no space for my voice in the airtight reality he had constructed. My initial paralysis slowly gave way to a desperate, clawing instinct for survival. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly against the hardwood floor, and demanded to see the evidence. I told him to march directly into his study, gather every single piece of paper, every photograph, every bank statement, and lay them all out on the glass coffee table right that very second. I practically begged him to show me the impossible, to let me look at the fabricated documents so I could instantly tear them apart and prove the massive, glaring inconsistencies. Evan took a deliberate step backward, physically recoiling from me as if my mere proximity was somehow toxic. He shook his head slowly, his jaw set in an immovable line of righteous indignation. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and absolute contempt. He stated firmly that he absolutely refused to drag those filthy documents out into the open. He told me he was entirely done playing my twisted games. He looked at the ceiling, let out a harsh, bitter breath, and said he would not allow himself to be manipulated by my fake tears and my clever, deceptive logic ever again. He declared that the truth was already locked away safely, and no amount of my silver-tongued negotiating could erase what he had already seen. That specific, arrogant refusal was the exact catalyst that snapped my mind entirely awake. The heavy, blinding fog of emotional devastation instantly evaporated, leaving behind a razor-sharp, freezing clarity. If those documents were genuine, if he truly held the undeniable proof of my ultimate betrayal, he would have violently shoved them directly into my face the second he walked into the room. A betrayed, furious husband wants his cheating wife to look at her own sins. He wants to watch her crumble under the undeniable weight of the truth. But Evan was hiding the paperwork. He was aggressively protecting the evidence from my scrutiny because the evidence could not withstand even a single minute of my direct examination. In that fleeting fraction of a second, a seemingly innocent, entirely forgotten memory from exactly 3 weeks prior violently clicked into place. It had been a quiet Wednesday afternoon. I was working from the kitchen island when Lorraine let herself in through the side door. She had smiled her usual, tight-lipped smile and asked if she could briefly borrow the high-speed laser printer in our home office. She claimed her own machine at the estate was broken, and she urgently needed to print out several dozen pages of updated medical insurance renewals. I had barely looked up from my laptop, blindly trusting the mundane excuse. I remembered the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the printer running steadily for nearly 20 minutes down the hall. I remembered the thick, heavy stack of warm paper she kept clutched tightly against her chest as she briskly walked back out to her luxury car, deliberately avoiding my gaze. She had not been printing insurance forms. She had been manufacturing my execution. I did not scream. I did not fall to my knees and beg Evan to blindly trust the woman he married over the papers his mother handed him. I looked at the man standing across from me, a man so thoroughly brainwashed by a master manipulator that he could no longer distinguish his own reality from a meticulously forged lie, and I realized that arguing with him was completely useless. You cannot use genuine emotion to fight a war that the enemy has already rigged with fake data. I turned around without saying a single word. I walked away from him, leaving him standing alone in the center of the room with his rehearsed, righteous anger. I slowly climbed the oak staircase, each step heavy and deliberate. I walked into the master bedroom, closed the heavy wooden door behind me, and turned the brass lock until it clicked loudly in the silence. I did not turn on the bedside lamps. I slid down the wall and sat on the cold floor in the pitch-black darkness. For the first hour, the sheer, agonizing pain of the betrayal burned through my chest like acid. But as the dark hours of the night dragged on, the intense, searing agony began to harden. The devastated, heartbroken wife slowly bled out on that floor, and someone entirely different took her place. I sat in the dark and meticulously organized the sudden, violent shift in power. Lorraine thought she had won because she had successfully weaponized paperwork. She assumed I would react like a typical, emotional victim. She expected me to panic, to cry, to lose my mind in front of Evan, thereby perfectly confirming the erratic, guilty behavior she had written into her script. When the first gray light of dawn finally broke through the bedroom window blinds, I stood up. I was completely empty of grief, filled entirely with a cold, terrifying, and highly calculated purpose. I did not reach for my phone to call my closest friend and sob into the receiver. I did not frantically search the internet for a standard family law attorney to file a defensive, desperate divorce petition. I knew exactly what kind of war I was fighting now. I picked up my phone, stepped into the bathroom, and ran the shower to mask the sound of my voice. I made 2 very specific, highly deliberate phone calls. The first was to a ruthless private investigator. The second was to a high-level digital forensics auditor. I understood with absolute certainty that I could never win this battle by pleading for Evan to remember our love. I was going to systematically hunt down every single piece of fake data his mother had manufactured, tear her pristine forgery to shreds, and use the sheer, undeniable truth to absolutely destroy her. The morning after the confrontation, I waited in absolute silence until Evan finally left for the corporate office. I bypassed the paralyzing emotional shock entirely and moved straight into a state of tactical survival. I quietly slipped into his private study, located his heavy leather briefcase, and used the spare brass key he arrogantly thought he had hidden well inside his desk drawer. Inside were the very documents he had so violently refused to show me the night before. I did not read them to weep over the cruel lies printed on the pages. I laid them perfectly flat on the mahogany desk and systematically photographed every single page with my phone, capturing the fabricated text messages, the fake hotel receipts, and the altered bank statements. Then, I put everything back exactly as I found it, leaving no trace of my presence. By noon, I was sitting rigidly in the sterile, unlisted office of Tessa Cole. Tessa was a highly experienced private investigator, but she did not handle typical, messy infidelity cases. She specialized exclusively in severe domestic harassment cleverly disguised as complex property disputes. She knew exactly how wealthy families use their vast resources, legal intimidation, and covert surveillance to break unwanted spouses. Sitting right next to her at the large conference table was Gavin Pike, a highly sought-after digital forensics auditor whose entire professional career revolved around tracing edited documents, forged financial statements, and unauthorized network access. I slid my phone across the polished wood, displaying the captured photographs of my alleged sins. Gavin uploaded the high-resolution images to a secure terminal and immediately began his meticulous dissection. It took him less than 45 minutes to completely dismantle the terrifying reality Evan had chosen to believe in. Gavin pointed his pen at the large monitor, zooming in tightly on the printed bank statement of the supposed secret account. He explained in a calm, clinical voice that the document was a crude digital manipulation. The baseline grid of the text was entirely misaligned. The specific font used for the deposited amounts did not match the proprietary typeface legally licensed by that specific local community bank. More importantly, he ran a structural analysis on the pixel degradation around the edges of the text blocks and confirmed it was a spliced compilation. Someone had deliberately taken a legitimate, blank statement template and pasted my name and manipulated dollar amounts over it using basic image editing software. The digital export layer was entirely inconsistent with actual banking software standards. It was a complete fake, likely generated on a home computer, printed out on a standard laser printer, and presented to my husband as absolute gospel. While Gavin tore apart the financial forgery piece by piece, Tessa focused entirely on the human element of the attack. She asked me to reconstruct my daily calendar for the past 12 months with excruciating detail. We spent hours cross-referencing my demanding work schedule, my specific late nights at the consulting firm, my municipal board meetings, and my weekend errands. Then, Tessa overlaid Evan's sudden, interrogating questions and his inexplicable, dramatic shifts in mood onto my schedule. Finally, we mapped out every single time Lorraine Mercer had physically set foot inside my home. The resulting timeline spread across Tessa's massive corkboard was undeniable. It formed a perfect, horrifying, and incredibly precise pattern. The specific dates Evan coldly accused me of being completely unreachable matched the exact afternoons Lorraine had stopped by unannounced to deliver food or measure a room for imaginary renovations. Every single time, Evan suddenly grew distant and began asking rapid-fire questions about my whereabouts. His mother had been granted unsupervised access to our shared living spaces, our discarded mail on the kitchen counter, and our home office just 24 to 48 hours prior. She was entirely managing the flow of poisonous information, planting the seeds of doubt exactly when she had the physical opportunity to gather the necessary fertilizer. But one massive, terrifying question remained completely unanswered. How did Lorraine obtain the highly specific, accurate details of my daily professional life to make her vicious lies sound so incredibly convincing? The fake hotel receipts Evan possessed matched the exact dates I had actually been working late at the office. The supposed illicit text messages from Miles Avery perfectly mirrored the exact hours we had been stuck together in long, tedious municipal zoning meetings. Lorraine was not just taking wild guesses. She possessed my actual hour-by-hour schedule. As Gavin began asking detailed questions about the internet network security protocols in my house, a sudden, violently cold memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. My blood turned to absolute ice. Roughly 1 year ago, during the bustling holiday season, Lorraine had arrived at our front door holding a brightly wrapped box. She generously gave us a sleek, high-end digital photo frame, insisting in her sweet, practiced voice that it would be a lovely addition to our living room decor. She even offered to set the device up herself, specifically connecting it to our home wireless internet network so she could remotely upload vintage family vacation pictures for us to continuously enjoy. I had foolishly thought it was a rare, genuinely thoughtful gesture aimed at warming our home. I immediately left Tessa's office, drove straight back to my empty house, unplugged the sleek black frame from the living room console, and brought it directly back to Gavin. He did not hesitate. He unscrewed the back casing, bypassed the simple display mechanism, and connected the internal main board straight to his diagnostic equipment. The silence in the small office grew incredibly heavy as endless lines of code rapidly scrolled across his bright monitor. Gavin finally looked up, his expression entirely grim and devoid of any professional detachment. The device was not just innocently displaying family photographs, it was actively functioning as a network bridge. Because it was permanently connected to our internal wireless network, the frame had been quietly logging our internet traffic routing history for the better part of a year. But the malicious intrusion went much deeper than simply tracking which websites Evan and I visited. Whenever I worked from home, I connected my corporate laptop to that exact same wireless network. Gavin discovered that the customized, hidden firmware installed on the digital frame had actively probed the local network for shared folders, unsecured devices, and synchronized calendars. It had created a small, highly persistent vulnerability in my digital life. It could not read the highly encrypted, protected contents of my municipal data files, but it absolutely could scrape the unencrypted surface data broadcasting across the network. It systematically scraped my meeting times. It scraped the subject lines of my incoming work emails. It scraped the names of my frequent contacts, specifically and repeatedly logging exactly how often I communicated with my colleague Miles Avery. The sheer scale of the calculated violation left me completely breathless. I stared at the lines of code on the screen, my stomach twisting into a tight, agonizing knot. This entirely explained exactly why the fabricated evidence of my infidelity was so dangerously effective and nearly impossible for Evan to instantly refute. The specific dates, the exact times, the geographical locations, and the names involved were all entirely real. Lorraine had taken the completely innocent, mundane, and honest framework of my actual life and simply injected a lethal, highly toxic dose of fiction directly into the hollow spaces. She maliciously used my real late meetings and twisted them into dirty hotel rendezvous. She used my real, boring project emails with Miles and distorted them into a passionate, secret affair. Lorraine did not just sit in the safety of her sprawling, luxurious estate and invent a random story from afar. She had physically, deliberately infiltrated my absolute safest sanctuary. She had essentially placed a digital spy right in the center of my living room, looking me straight in the eye and smiling warmly at me while she plugged it directly into the wall. She had entirely weaponized the very rhythm of my daily existence, maliciously using the honest, exhausting hours I spent building my career and contributing to our household to construct a flawless, undeniably convincing version of betrayal that my husband eventually swallowed whole. I finally realized the terrifying magnitude of my situation. I was not just fighting a bitter, overly attached mother-in-law. I was fighting a highly calculated predator who had been silently hunting me from the inside of my own home for nearly a solid year. The air in the small, windowless office grew thicker with every passing hour as Gavin continued to pull apart the digital threads of my ruined life. We were no longer just looking at a misguided husband or a simple misunderstanding. We were actively excavating a meticulously designed crime scene. Gavin leaned closer to his glowing monitors, his fingers flying across the quiet keyboard. He had bypassed the superficial layers of the fabricated evidence and started hunting the actual origins of the digital traffic. He brought up a heavily encrypted data log and pointed to a specific, anonymous email that had been successfully routed directly into my husband's private, highly secure business inbox. Attached to this phantom email was a beautifully rendered, official-looking document. It was a lease deposit confirmation for a luxury, short-term rental apartment located deep in the heart of the upscale downtown district. The sender address was a very clever, highly deceptive variation of my maiden name, deliberately structured to look exactly like a careless, accidental forward on my part. It was designed to make him believe I was quietly securing a high-end bachelor pad to conduct my fictional affair. But the genius of a digital forensic auditor lies in ignoring the obvious lie and hunting the invisible truth. Gavin completely ignored the fake name and pulled the deep digital headers embedded in the email's source code. He aggressively traced the unique media access control identifier, the specific hardware fingerprint of the actual device that generated and sent the message over the network. The long alphanumeric string of text did not point to a random internet cafe or a hired hacker in a distant country. It perfectly matched the specific network identifier of the expensive, rose gold tablet my mother-in-law carried meticulously in her designer leather tote bag everywhere she went. She had sat in her sunlit parlor, sipping tea, and personally typed out the poison. While Gavin unraveled the digital infrastructure, Tessa returned to the conference table with her own horrifying stack of physical revelations. She spread out a carefully organized sequence of printed papers. There were several parking garage receipts, 2 expensive dinner bills from a high-end steakhouse, and a grainy, highly zoomed-in photograph of me briskly walking through the revolving glass doors of a massive commercial office building. I stared down at the images and the crinkled receipts, feeling the warm blood completely drain from my face. My hands began to shake slightly. Every single item laying on the polished wood table was technically, terrifyingly real. I had physically parked my car in that exact underground garage on a rainy Tuesday. I had eaten a late dinner at that specific steakhouse on a Thursday night. I had walked through that exact building lobby just last month. But as Tessa gently tapped her pen against the documents, She pointed out the brutal, highly calculated omissions. The reality had been surgically altered. The dinner receipts were meticulously cropped just above the guest count line, deliberately hiding the absolute fact that the table was seated for 6 municipal contractors, not a romantic table for 2. The grainy photograph of me entering the building was violently cropped just inches to my right, completely erasing the 3 other project managers who were walking right beside me, holding identical briefcases. The chilling realization washed over me like a bucket of freezing winter ice. My mother-in-law did not simply invent a crude, clumsy, and easily disproved lie from thin air. A complete fabrication would have been too risky, too easy for me to immediately tear down with a solid alibi. Instead, she did something infinitely more sinister. She actively harvested the mundane, boring truth of my exhausting professional life. She took my real movements, my actual locations, and my genuine receipts. Then, she shredded that truth into tiny, unrecognizable pieces and expertly stitched them back together to create a flawless, suffocating monster. She built a cage out of my own reality. However, a fictional romance was only one half of the trap. To fully activate the devastating penalty clause buried deep within the prenuptial agreement, the campaign required a solid, undeniable financial motive. She needed to legally prove that I was a hostile actor preparing to severely damage the family estate. Gavin ran a deep, comprehensive audit on my personal credit history and banking inquiries. He flagged a highly irregular, formal request placed exactly 4 months ago. Someone had officially requested a comprehensive, certified copy of my entire credit file and asset history from a major credit bureau. The digital request form was authorized using a clumsily forged, electronic version of my signature. It was the absolute perfect foundational brick for her legal narrative. By generating that specific documented inquiry, she deliberately planted the undeniable digital footprint of a greedy wife secretly taking inventory of her independent assets. It perfectly laid the groundwork for the story that I was quietly preparing to aggressively split the marital wealth, liquidate my positions, and vanish into the night with my supposed lover. But the absolute most damning piece of the entire puzzle, the smoking gun that instantly elevated this nightmare from a bitter family dispute into a fully coordinated, multi-person conspiracy, came from a small, insignificant piece of plastic. Gavin successfully found the original billing source for the shady digital application that generated the fake, explicit text messages between my bewildered coworker and me. The monthly subscription was paid for using a prepaid, entirely untraceable retail gift card. To the average person, a prepaid card is a dead end. But a prepaid card must be physically activated at a retail cash register before it can be used online. Tessa took the unique serial number Gavin extracted and tracked the activation sequence to a sprawling chain pharmacy located exactly 3 miles away from the massive iron gates of the Mercer family estate. Armed with her private investigator credentials, a polite smile, and an intimidating knowledge of local privacy laws, she convinced the hesitant store manager to pull the high-definition security camera footage from the exact hour of the purchase. The room fell completely silent as Tessa slid a glossy, printed still frame across the table toward me. I looked down at the grainy black and white image, fully expecting to see a hired stranger, a local teenager paid in cash, or perhaps my mother-in-law herself wearing a large hat and dark sunglasses. Instead, a wave of pure, unfiltered nausea hit my stomach, forcing me to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. The woman standing at the brightly lit register, casually handing over crisp cash for the prepaid card, was a face I had known intimately for nearly a decade. It was the longtime personal assistant of the Mercer family. She was a quiet, highly efficient woman who had sat comfortably in my living room on countless occasions. She had cheerfully drank my coffee, helped me arrange flowers for holiday dinners, and smiled warmly at me for years. She moved effortlessly through the most private, secure corners of our lives, treated almost entirely like an extended, trusted relative. The heavy corkboard in front of me was now completely illuminated. The scattered, confusing pieces of the past year violently snapped together into a singular, horrifying picture. This was no longer just the tragic, common story of an overbearing mother quietly whispering toxic rumors into her vulnerable son's ear. This was a highly funded, meticulously prepared, and aggressively executed corporate assassination of a marriage. She possessed specialized digital tools. She possessed the ruthless intelligence to manipulate physical infrastructure and financial records. She possessed a loyal, well-paid accomplice who was perfectly willing to commit federal fraud on her behalf. And every single moving part of this elaborate, terrifying machine was aimed squarely at one singular, obsessive goal. She needed to manipulate the narrative so perfectly, so completely, and so legally that my husband would feel he had absolutely no other choice but to be the one to sign his name and file for divorce first. I possessed the weapon, but a weapon is entirely useless if fired at the wrong angle. My immediate burning instinct was to storm directly back to the house, kick open the door to Evan's study, and violently hurl the thick stack of forensic reports right at his chest. I wanted to scream until my vocal cords bled. I wanted to force him to look at the undeniable proof of his mother's sociopathic campaign, but the freezing, calculated survival mechanism that had taken over my brain firmly held me back. I knew Evan intimately. I knew the fragile, intricate architecture of his pride. If I attacked him while his defensive walls were fully raised, while he was still comfortably wrapped in his rehearsed anger, human psychology would inevitably take over. He would be far too ashamed to admit he had been so profoundly fooled. His ego would desperately cling to the familiar lies simply because the crushing humiliation of the truth would be too immense to process all at once. He would deny the digital evidence. He would accuse me of hiring people to fabricate the forensic reports. The argument would devolve into chaos, and Lorraine would instantly find a way to spin it. I needed a surgical strike, not a messy explosion. I made the deliberate, agonizing choice to wait. I would not say a single word until the exact moment Evan formally presented the final divorce petition. I needed Lorraine to feel absolute, intoxicating victory. Predators are always the most reckless right before they consume their prey. If she firmly believed I was a broken, weeping mess frantically packing my bags, she would drop her guard entirely. She would never anticipate a counterattack because she genuinely thought I had already bled out on the floor. While I played the role of the silent, defeated wife wandering the halls like a ghost, I hired a ruthless, independent family law attorney. I sat in his high-rise office and demanded he tear apart the original marital contract word by word. I needed absolute, airtight confirmation of the clause that had triggered this entire nightmare. The attorney reviewed the dusty pages and gave me the legal blessing I required. He confirmed that the stipulation was ironclad. If Evan actively initiated the dissolution of the marriage, my legal right to claim the massively appreciated commercial land would instantly become active. Lorraine had spent years obsessively plotting to protect that specific piece of earth, and by forcing her son to file the paperwork, she was blindly handing me the very key to the vault. I spent the next several days meticulously transforming our dining room table into a war room whenever Evan was out of the house. I organized the overwhelming mountain of evidence into 3 distinct, devastatingly precise layers. The first layer was the digital forensic data. This folder contained Gavin's exhaustive reports, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the bank statements were digitally spliced. The hotel receipts were harvested from legitimate business trips, and the text messages were generated by a paid application. The second layer was the financial chain of custody. This included the retail security camera photographs of the Mercer family assistant purchasing the prepaid cards, completely destroying the illusion that this was a distant, anonymous misunderstanding. The third layer was perhaps the most psychologically damaging. It was a comprehensive, day-by-day timeline spanning the previous 18 months. Tessa and I had mapped out every single instance Lorraine had planted a seed of doubt, correlating her unsupervised visits to our home directly with Evan's sudden, chilling interrogations. It was a visual map of a mother deliberately poisoning her own son's mind, feeding him a toxic diet of paranoia, drop by agonizing drop. But I needed one final, undeniable nail to permanently seal the coffin. Tessa understood the assignment perfectly. Operating under the strict legal framework of our state, which allowed for one-party consent regarding audio recordings. She orchestrated a highly calculated, seemingly accidental encounter with Lorraine's personal assistant at a local coffee shop. Tessa posed as a disgruntled, gossiping real estate paralegal complaining about wealthy clients. The assistant, feeling a false sense of camaraderie and eager to prove her own proximity to elite circles, let her guard down. She leaned across the small cafe table and arrogantly slipped up. The hidden microphone captured her voice perfectly, boasting that she had recently run a few highly discreet errands for Mrs. Mercer specifically regarding a very sensitive property matter to help protect the family legacy from an outsider. It was a brief, arrogant confession, but it was legally obtained and utterly damning. During this intense period of quiet preparation, Tessa also tracked down my bewildered coworker. Miles Avery was a quiet, dedicated data analyst who practically lived in his cubicle. When Tessa finally sat him down and explained the massive, grotesque fiction he had been unknowingly written into, the poor man was completely horrified. He had absolutely no idea his professional name had been dragged through the mud to justify a corporate divorce. Miles did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately agreed to sign a legally binding affidavit swearing that our relationship was strictly professional. Furthermore, he voluntarily provided his certified corporate server logs, proving unequivocally that every single digital communication between us over the past 2 years consisted exclusively of municipal zoning data and project spreadsheets. As my arsenal grew complete, a strange, heavy emotional shift occurred within me. The blinding, white-hot rage I initially felt toward my husband began to slowly cool, solidifying into a profound, suffocating sorrow. Watching Evan pack a small overnight bag one evening, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a false tragedy. I realized the true horror of the situation. My husband was not just a naive fool who had carelessly stumbled into a trap. He was a lifelong victim. From the time he was a small boy, Lorraine had systematically trained him to completely distrust his own instincts. She had conditioned him to inherently believe that her wealthy, paranoid worldview was the only absolute truth, and that his own direct experiences were flawed. He was not rejecting the woman he slept next to every night. He was simply obeying the commanding, domineering voice that had controlled his entire existence. The betrayal was no longer just about me. It was about a man who had been ruthlessly stripped of his own mind by the woman who gave him life. The night before the inevitable confrontation, the house was completely silent. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving a cold, damp stillness in the air. Evan was sleeping in the guest bedroom, a physical manifestation of the massive chasm his mother had successfully carved between us. I sat alone at the long mahogany dining table, illuminated only by a single, warm brass lamp. The rest of the grand house was swallowed in deep shadow. I laid the 3 thick manila folders out in a perfectly straight line on the polished wood. I picked up a black pen and began deliberately labeling each section: digital forensics, financial trace, psychological timeline. The rhythmic scratch of the pen against the thick paper was the only sound in the suffocating quiet. My hands were completely steady. My heartbeat was a slow, calm drum. I was no longer the devastated, weeping wife Lorraine Mercer had envisioned in her arrogant fantasies. I was the architect of her absolute ruin. I stared at the neat stacks of paper, knowing with terrifying certainty that when the sun rose tomorrow morning, I would not just be legally saving my own reputation, I was going to systematically dismantle a monster in Kashmir. I was going to force my husband to look directly into the blinding light of the truth, and I was going to completely expose a mother who had maliciously used the sacred concept of family love as a lethal weapon. We are back in the suffocating gray morning, standing exactly where this quiet execution was supposed to take place. The rain outside is a steady, bleak drumbeat against the large bay windows. Evan stands on the opposite side of the sprawling marble island. He has just pushed the thick, pristine stack of divorce papers across the cold stone toward me. The expensive silver pen lay perfectly parallel to the signature line, a gleaming invitation to quietly surrender everything I had left. Lorraine Mercer sat in the tufted linen chair in the breakfast nook just a few steps away. Her hands are neatly folded in her lap. Her face is a terrifying portrait of serene, quiet victory. She is patiently waiting for the inevitable weeping, the desperate begging, the final pathetic curtain call of my ruined marriage. I do not reach for the silver pen. I do not even glance at the heavy legal jargon demanding the immediate dissolution of our union. I place both of my hands flat against the cold marble to steady myself, not from any lingering fear, but from the immense, vibrating adrenaline of a hunted woman who has finally trapped her predator. I slowly reach down into the large leather tote bag, resting heavily against my leg. I pull out the 3 thick, meticulously labeled manila folders I assembled the night before. I lift them and drop them directly on top of his legal documents. The heavy, flat thud echoes violently in the quiet room, instantly shattering the delicate tension. I look directly into Evan's empty eyes and speak in a voice so incredibly soft and completely devoid of emotion that it instantly commands the entire room. I tell him that before anyone signs their name to a single page today, he needs to sit down and thoroughly read every single thing his mother carelessly left behind. The absolute stillness of the room breaks. Lorraine's serene mask violently cracks. She pushes herself up from the chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She marches toward the kitchen island, her beige cashmere sweater suddenly looking less like the armor of old wealth and more like a costume she is rapidly outgrowing. She points a perfectly manicured finger at the heavy folders and sharply tells Evan to completely ignore me. She calls my documents a pathetic, desperate stalling tactic from a guilty woman trying to buy time she does not deserve. She commands him, using that familiar, domineering tone she has successfully used to control his entire life, to force me to sign the papers immediately. I completely ignore her existence. I keep my gaze locked entirely on my husband. I reach out and flip open the first heavy folder. I bypass the typed summaries and go straight to the digital forensics report detailing the fabricated bank statement. I point my finger directly at the blown-up, high-resolution images of the forged document. I tell Evan, keeping my tone entirely clinical and detached, to look closely at the misaligned typographical grid. I tell him to read the auditor notes detailing exactly how the specific pixel degradation proves the dollar amounts were digitally pasted over a blank template. I point out the file export layers that completely contradict standard banking software encryption protocols. Evan stands completely rigid for 3 long seconds. He desperately wants to look away. He wants to blindly trust the narrative he has already accepted and mourned, but the sheer, highly organized volume of the evidence sitting directly under his nose is a gravitational pull he simply cannot resist. He slowly reaches out. His hand is trembling slightly. He turns the first page, then he turns the next. The flat, exhausted emptiness in his dark eyes begins to fracture, rapidly replaced by a wild, terrifying panic as his brain processes the undeniable truth. He flips past the highly technical breakdown of the fake hotel receipts. He reads the sworn, legally binding affidavit from Miles Avery. He stares at the attached corporate server logs that prove every single late-night message was strictly about municipal zoning data and nothing else. He looks at the glossy, high-definition security camera photographs showing his mother's trusted personal assistant standing at a pharmacy cash register, purchasing the untraceable prepaid gift cards used to generate the fake text messages. He reads the horrifying wireless extraction logs from the digital photo frame his mother personally plugged into our living room wall, seeing exactly how she harvested my daily schedule to build her highly convincing lies. The only sound in the massive kitchen is the rapid, frantic turning of thick paper and Evan's increasingly ragged, uneven breathing. Then, he reaches the final page of the digital tracing report. His hands suddenly freeze completely still. He stares down at the highlighted section detailing the unique hardware fingerprint. It is the specific media access control identifier extracted directly from the anonymous email that sent him the fake downtown apartment lease. I watch the exact devastating moment my husband's entire worldview violently collapses. He knows that specific, long alphanumeric string. He recognizes the hardware registration code. It legally belongs to the custom-engraved, rose gold tablet he personally purchased and configured for his mother exactly 2 Christmases ago. Lorraine sees the color completely drained from her son's face. She realizes with horrifying clarity that her flawless, untouchable script has been entirely burned to ashes right in front of her. She steps right up to the edge of the marble island, her dark eyes darting frantically between Evan and the damning forensic reports. Her mouth is suddenly incredibly dry. Her impeccable, aristocratic poise evaporates, leaving behind nothing but the chaotic, scrambling panic of a cornered criminal trying to escape a burning building. She begins to stammer, her voice shrill and entirely unconvincing. She frantically tells Evan that the tablet must have been stolen from her parlor by a careless housekeeper. She wildly accuses me of hiring a team of dark web hackers to illegally infiltrate her home network, steal her identity, and frame her just to save my own greedy skin. She is throwing every single desperate, absurd excuse against the wall, praying blindly that his lifetime of conditioned loyalty will somehow miraculously save her. I do not argue with her. I do not waste my breath trying to shout down her pathetic, crumbling lies. I simply reach into my pocket, pull out my cellular phone, and tap the screen exactly once. I set the device down gently on the cool marble, right next to the forgotten divorce papers. The recorded audio file begins to play, slicing through the tense, suffocating air of the kitchen with perfect, undeniable clarity. It is the arrogant, gossiping voice of her longtime personal assistant. The woman is sitting in a crowded cafe, casually boasting to a complete stranger about running highly sensitive, discreet errands for Mrs. Mercer specifically regarding a lucrative land clause, doing whatever it takes to permanently protect the family estate from a greedy outsider. The short recording ends with a soft, final click. The ensuing silence in the kitchen is not just heavy, it is completely absolute. It is the terrifying, deafening silence of a massive structural collapse after the violent dust has finally settled. Lorraine stops speaking mid-sentence. She stands completely frozen, her face entirely ashen, staring down at the small black phone as if it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at her chest. I take a slow step back from the island, crossing my arms over my chest, letting the absolute, crushing devastation of the truth fill the entire room. I expect Evan to look at me. I vaguely expect him to offer a desperate, broken apology for ever doubting my loyalty, for putting me through a living hell, but he does not look at me at all. He slowly lifts his heavy head from the mountain of forensic evidence. He turns his body entirely away from the divorce papers, completely away from me, and looks directly at the woman who gave him life. His face is a mask of pure, unadulterated heartbreak and complete horror. He looks at her not as a son looking at a loving mother, but as a man who has just realized he was nothing more than a blind, hollow tool expertly wielded by his own flesh and blood. He asks her one single, quiet question. How long have you been doing this? The silence in the kitchen stretches out, thick and suffocating. Lorraine does not answer him right away. She does not open her mouth to offer a single syllable of defense. In the absolute quiet of that room, her profound, terrifying silence becomes her very first honest confession. I watch the precise moment Evan breaks. His broad shoulders completely collapse. The rigid posture of a righteous, deeply wounded husband instantly evaporates, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a man. He finally understands that every single ounce of his agonizing pain, his bitter resentment, and his cold contempt toward me had been artificially manufactured. He had spent the last several months fiercely mourning the death of our marriage, completely unaware that his own mother was the one secretly injecting poison into its veins. I do not let the heavy silence linger long enough for her to formulate a new, desperate lie. I reach across the marble island and push the second heavy folder toward her. I tell her the financial auditors successfully tracked the prepaid retail cards. I tell her Tessa secured the high-definition pharmacy surveillance photographs. I watch the remaining color drain entirely from her face, as I plainly state that federal wire fraud is a remarkably steep price to pay just to keep a piece of commercial dirt securely within the family trust. That specific phrase acts as a violent spark hitting dry kindling. The elegant, controlled matriarch vanishes completely. Lorraine shatters into a sudden, raw explosion of pure, unadulterated rage. She slams her hands down onto the countertop, her perfectly manicured nails clicking sharply against the cold stone. She completely abandons the maternal, protective act. She stops pretending she ever cared about Evan's broken heart. Instead, she begins to scream frantically about the estate. She rants about the logistics corridor expansion and the massive, unearned fortune sitting right on the edge of the county line. She looks at me with bottomless, venomous disgust and declares that she would never, under any circumstances, allow a common outsider to walk away with a commercial asset that rightfully belonged to her bloodline. She admits, in a breathless fit of absolute fury, that she had to do whatever was necessary to protect her legacy from a woman who only married into the family for a free ride. Evan flinches as if she had physically struck him across the face. He stares at the woman screaming wildly about property valuations and zoning laws, completely deaf to the immense human collateral damage she deliberately caused. The ultimate crushing realization washes over his entire body. He is not the tragic hero of this story. He is not even the primary victim. He is nothing more than the perfect, oblivious tool in his mother's aggressive legal strategy. She desperately needed someone to formally file the divorce papers to trigger the protective clause and sever my claim to the land. She could not do it herself, so she simply turned her son into her personal executioner. He realizes he was entirely weaponized to legitimize her bottomless greed. He looks down at the thick stack of divorce papers he confidently brought into the kitchen, the papers he entirely expected me to sign in a puddle of guilty tears. I reach out, pick up the expensive silver pen lying on the island, and calmly place it back into his trembling hand. I tell him in a perfectly steady voice that I will absolutely not be signing his documents today or tomorrow. I announce to both of them that exactly 1 hour before Evan walked through the front door, my own legal counsel formally filed a separate, preemptive petition with the family court. I did not file to salvage a dead relationship. I filed to aggressively protect my personal dignity, my rightful share of our genuine marital assets, and my absolute legal right to pursue severe civil damages for the malicious fabrication of evidence. Lorraine lets out a harsh, bitter laugh, crossing her arms defensively across her chest. She immediately assumes I'm finally playing the exact hand she always anticipated. She arrogantly tells me to take the barren commercial lot and choke on it, but this is the exact moment I take her carefully constructed narrative and completely snap it in half. I look her dead in the eye and tell her she can keep the dirt. I officially waive my right to the commercial property. The arrogant sneer on her face instantly freezes into a mask of pure, absolute confusion. She spent years meticulously planning a ruthless psychological war to protect a specific financial asset, and I am voluntarily leaving it on the table. I explain to her, my voice echoing coldly in the large room, that I refuse to validate her twisted worldview. I refuse to take the money and formally prove to her that I was the greedy opportunist she always claimed I was. Taking that specific land would mean playing by her sick, twisted rules, and I am entirely done participating in the Mercer family games. However, I make it abundantly clear that I am not walking away empty-handed. I point directly to the mountain of forensic evidence resting on the counter. I inform them that my legal team is currently using every single forged document, every scraped digital calendar invite, and every illegally recorded internet log to launch a massive, unprecedented civil lawsuit. I am not suing for a simple divorce settlement. I am suing Lorraine personally, alongside her trusted assistant, for illegal tortious interference in a marriage, systemic document forgery, unauthorized digital data intrusion, and severe professional defamation. I am dragging her pristine, carefully guarded reputation out of the shadows and directly into the unforgiving light of a public courtroom. She desperately wanted a legal battle to protect her wealth. I am giving her a legal battle that will cost her infinitely more than a single plot of land. Lorraine opens her mouth, but absolutely no sound comes out. The sheer, catastrophic magnitude of her miscalculation has finally paralyzed her. Evan slowly walks around the kitchen island. He stops a few feet away from me. The anger is completely gone from his dark eyes, replaced by a desperate, drowning sorrow. He reaches out, his hand hovering in the empty space between us, terrified to actually touch my skin. His voice breaks as he deeply begs me to stop the legal filings. He pleads with me to give him a second chance, to let him make this right, to let him thoroughly prove that he can cut her out of his life forever. He heavily swears he loves me and that we can rebuild everything she systematically destroyed. I look at the man I deeply loved. I look at the quiet, steady anchor I built my entire adult life around. But the broken man standing in front of me is a complete stranger. I do not offer him a warm smile, and I do not offer him my forgiveness. I tell him the absolute most devastating truth of all. The precious thing his mother stole from me was not just my reputation or his trust. She violently stole nearly 2 years of my actual, breathing life. I spent hundreds of days and nights twisting myself into knots, trying tirelessly to save a man who was actively evaluating my every spoken word against a fake script. I cannot unlive that suffocating nightmare, and I cannot unsee how incredibly easy it was for him to believe the absolute worst of me. I do not wait for his painful response. I turn my back on the pristine kitchen, the marble countertops, and the shattered remnants of the Mercer legacy. I gracefully pick up my leather bag and walk straight down the hallway. I open the heavy front door and step out into the sharp, freezing afternoon air. The rain has completely stopped, leaving the quiet suburban street washed clean and blindingly bright. I walk down the long driveway without looking over my shoulder a single time. I am not a discarded, defeated wife being quietly pushed out the back door. I am the only person in this entire tragedy who possesses the immense courage to look the ugly truth right in the face and survive it. Lorraine spent an entire year meticulously planting invisible traps all over my home, desperate to orchestrate my absolute destruction. But as I walk away, I feel nothing but a profound, liberating peace. The very same footprints she carelessly left in the dark to ruin my life have become the exact weapons that will publicly, legally, and permanently dismantle hers. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. Also, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.